everyone. This is Professor Warren, and today we're doing our lecture on reading critically. Now, I do highly suggest that you read the accompany reading for this lecture, so read that beforehand before watching this lecture. It'll help if there's any confusion as you're listening to me to understand what it is that I'm talking about. So I do highly recommend that you read the reading beforehand and then come back to this lecture. So, I assume you've already read the reading, so let's go through and I'll highlight some of the key points from the reading that I feel that you should know. So the first thing that we should talk about is active reading versus passive reading. Passive reading is essentially reading for pleasure. So again, we do passive reading every day, whether you're looking at someone's tweet or whether you're reading a book simply for the enjoyment of reading it, right? You're often passively reading. You're reading just for the enjoyment of it. You're not really, breaking it down to its bits and pieces. Active reading, on the other hand, is being engaged with the text. And what I mean by being engaged with the text is looking for the author's main argument, their main points, the evidence they provide, and their conclusions. So what should we gather after reading that? What conclusions should we make? So active reading is very much a difficult process for students, as you're often not trained in order to look for, arguments, evidence, conclusion, and, see if you're convinced persuasively by the author. So we have some strategies here that help you to be more of an active reader than a passive reader. Now, these are by all means not the only ways you can actively read, but these are the ones that are commonly known and the ones that people utilize generally. So some of these strategies are previewing, also called pre-reading, reading, actually reading the text, also known as close reading, and then rereading, which again is just reading the text one more time. So the first thing that you likely should do before you read a text is do previewing or pre-reading. So before you actually read the words on the page, it's a good practice to sort of look over it, sort of skim it, look at if there's any subtitles or subheadings, look at who wrote it, look at how long it is, look at the structure of the paper. And this is just a good way to sort of alleviate reading jitters. If you're somebody who, if you're given a piece of reading and it's super long, or you're kind of skimming through it and you're like, there's some big words in here I may not know, previewing can be sort of a way to sort of be introduced with the text before reading it and see what's in it that you need to be aware of before just going in at it blind. Previewing is also a good way to determine whether you need to read this piece slowly or quickly. So again, if you're somebody who, maybe is a slower reader and you preview it and you notice it's 20 pages, not including the works cited for the paper, and you're like, oh, there's also some big vocabulary in here, I may need an hour to do this, right? So previewing lets you know, okay, does this piece need to be read quickly, or can I, take my time with it because it's going to need some time? Previewing also helps you determine whether you need any outside research before you start reading it. So again, if you sort of skim through it and say you see a word like Marxism and you don't understand what Marxism is, it might be good for you to do research rather than as you're reading the text, you come across a big word, a big vocabulary word, and you're like, I don't know what that is, and then you have to stop, do research, come back, and by the time you come back, you may have forgotten, what the text was saying or where you're at. So it's good to, in the previewing stage, quickly glance through it, see if there's anything you don't know, like words like Marxism or maybe redlining, and be acquainted with it. Do a quick Google search, see what it is, and then come back to the text and start reading. Again, previewing also helps you determine whether the piece of reading or text that you have is even worth your time. When you get to the argumentative essay, you're going to have to find research. And, if you're reading an article, and you preview it beforehand, you can sort of say, okay, this might help my argument, or this may not help my argument. It's good to preview it and see if it's worth your time. Now, again, you have to read everything I give you in class, but when you get to your actual research essay and you're trying to find research, it's better to sort of preview a text, see if it's related to what you're talking about or might be useful, because it would suck if you're a slow reader and you spend, an hour on a piece of text that's not going to benefit your paper. So again, this is a good strategy, especially for your own independent research. Previewing also has what's called the first and last rule, and so essentially look at the first and last sentences of both the introductory paragraph and the conclusion, because likely the author's main argument or their main focus is going to be located towards usually the last sentences of the introductory paragraph or introductory section, and in the conclusion, they usually in those places, wrap up their ideas in those sections. Now, this isn't by all means the only places where the authors make valid points, but if you're somebody who, you don't truly understand authors' arguments, maybe that's a hard thing for you to comprehend, and maybe their conclusions, the first and last rule is a good strategy. Again, if you have trouble figuring out people's arguments, you can look in those sections and see if the arguments or conclusions are there. And if you're somebody who's previewing the text to say, hey, is this worth my time? You can quickly look in those parts in the text and see what their main argument and their main findings are to go ahead and see, is this piece worth my time? So for instance, in Uneasy Lies, this article here, again, it has an abstract, and abstracts are summaries, but say you read this abstract, or maybe let's pretend it doesn't have an abstract and you need to know if this piece is worth your time. So in this introductory paragraph, if we look at the first sentence, black hair in the United States has been heavily regulated. The history of the anti-black hair sentiment in the United States dates back to the introduction of African people to the country through slavery. In Western African societies, hairstyles communicated relationship status, maturity, spiritual connectivity, ethnic identity, capital, and class. So, again, we could continue with this, but this gives you a sense of what the paper is about, right? It's about how the U.S. has heavily regulated black hair as well as this anti-black hair sentiment. Now, if we look at, again, this last section in this introductory section, what we see here, again, this is roughly the last few sentences. The natural hair movement has gathered much attention, particularly on social media platforms, as it challenges Eurocentric norms and comes with great economic influence. Black women spend a disproportionate amount of time and money caring for their hair compared to other racial ethnic groups in the United States. 85% of the $63 million spent in the ethnic hair and beauty standards market was attributed to black shoppers in 2017. In 2018, the black hair care industry was worth more than $2.5 billion. So again, this sort of tells us, again, the author's thesis is not particularly here, but we do get a sense of, okay, so they're going to be talking about the natural hair movement and how that has gathered attention, particularly through social media, as well as how much money and time is required to maintain black hair. So then, if we preview this text, again, we see, okay, here's a subheading talking about the othering of black hair. Could be useful. That's also probably one of her main points. Here, again, we have hair-related court cases. Probably another main point, which is about the Crown Act, critical race theory, and even in this paper, she bolds and italicizes vocabulary that we should be aware of, right? The author is pointing us to these particular words, right? So obviously they're important. And if these were things that you're looking for, this author has, pointed these out, right, to you. We have a critical race analysis of the Crown Act. So again, this author introduces the othering of black hair, the Crown Act, and then critical race theory, and then here we can see, okay, so the author's putting this together, right? A critical race analysis of the Crown Act, goes more into counter storytelling, the permeance of racism, whiteness as property, and then critique of liberalism. So again, which was some of the things we saw, right, in that first sentence and those last few sentences, right? Interest convergence, and then here, again, this isn't always the case, but here the author has showed us, hey, here's my conclusion. They bolded it for you and made it into a subheading. So again, first and last sentences. Critical race theory purports that laws are used to intentionally maintain the status quo of whiteness. Blocking legislation that will disrupt the status quo achieves the same goal. As described by various media sources, stories, and the testimonials at the discrimination MJPC meeting, Black people in the United States continue to be othered, ostracized, and passed over for opportunities due to hair bias and prejudice. So again, good writers typically in their conclusion will very quickly give you sort of a synopsis of their main argument, and here is where that is, right? Again, because we previewed it, we saw some of her main points, and we see them mentioned again here, right? So that's obviously her main argument, or this author's main argument. And then again, if we look at the last few sentences, overt expression of racism is not necessary for it to thrive. Geez, if I could talk today, that'd be great. Failure to overtly challenge racism is enough to ensure its survival. The Crown Act is a very recent legislative development. As such, no cases have called upon its protection just yet. However, directly confronting racist subtleties in grooming policy is necessary and compels federal legislation and enforcement. Okay, so here, again, in your conclusion, you're sort of giving the wrap-up, what we should learn. And here, our author is telling us exactly what we should learn, which is, again, it's not overt racism, it's not necessary for it to thrive, it's that challenging racism is enough to ensure, the failure to challenge racism ensures its survival, right? And it says that the Crown Act, again, is that sort of legislative development, right? It's calling upon the need to sort of change these practices. In terms of the U.S. having this sort of bias against black hair, particularly black women's hair, right? And it says, we need to directly confront racist subtleties in grooming policies, which is necessary and compels federal legislation and enforcement. So, again, utilizing the first and last rule, we've gotten a lot without actually having to read this, right? We got an introduction to these ideas, we've gotten the main argument, we've looked over and saw some of the author's main points, and so here, we can get a good idea of what this is about before jumping headfirst into it. Another good thing about previewing is that, again, it asks us what questions we should know about the text. So again, if you followed with me on that text and you look through some of those subheadings, main argument, conclusions, and you still have questions, this is a good time during the previewing stage to write down those questions, so when you get to the next stage, which is actually reading the text, you can see if those questions you had were answered. So again, maybe one of your questions is, how does the U.S. discriminate against black women's hair, right? You could write that down on a sheet of paper, and as you're reading it, see if you can find that answer or evidence to prove that point. And so that goes into the reading section, right? So after you preview a text, now you're paying close attention to, again, the author's thesis, their purpose, the supporting evidence, the claims, and the quality of the information they're presenting to you. So during the reading stage, this is a good time to highlight, underline, and annotate. So again, underline keywords, highlight maybe key points, or maybe annotating, right? Writing over to the side, maybe you want to put a word in your own, maybe put a particular vocabulary in your own words, right? Maybe you write that over to the side, or maybe you say main thesis, or maybe you are criticizing the author, right? Maybe you don't make a good point, and you put, I'm not sure, right? You can annotate that. This way you've got it for when you review and reread the text. This is also just a great strategy because, again, it's showing that you're interacting with the text, right? It's almost like you're having a conversation with the text, as if they're physically, a manifestation of a person, right? Doing these sorts of things helps you talk with the text and understand this text. So while you're doing this, again, look for terms and concepts, look for identifiers as well as you're going through it. These can be good markers. Again, these are sort of voice markers to help you sort of see where crucial information is, right? So again, if you're looking for an argument, sometimes an author might put in this chapter, right? Or they'll say, I will argue. Words like ultimately sort of signal to you there's a conclusion of some sort here, as well as the words in conclusion, right? So look for identifiers. Those are also good reading strategies to sort of clue you in, and it's like a big red flag sort of waving at you, say, hey, pay attention to me, right? As you're, again, engaging in close reading, pay attention for anything, any particular language used in the book. Pay attention to specific details and patterns. So again, as you're close reading, ask yourself some of these questions, right? What language is the author using, right? Are they authoritative? Are they sort of stating their opinion? Or is the language the author using sort of a little bit, or I would say laced with ambiguity, right? Is it not very clear? Does the way in which the writer utilized their language, is it unclear what they're saying? Do they not seem very sure about what they're saying? Ask yourself, is the argument convincing, right? Or is it failing to do something for you? Again, ask yourself these questions, right? Just because I give you an academic article, or just because you find a piece of evidence, an academic article, doesn't mean you have to be convinced by their argument, right? Sometimes there are people who write things that, aren't very persuasive. So ask yourself, is it convincing me? If so, why? If not, what is it failing to do? And here's just some other sort of questions you can ask, which is along the same lines, right? You can ask things like, while I understand the argument, I don't think the author explains such and such well, right? If you're convinced by the argument, maybe you could ask, okay, I'm convinced by the argument, however, I think the author should have looked at this, or should have considered this, or should have mentioned this, right? Or maybe you're just not sure what the author means when they say, whatever it is that they're saying, right? So I should look out as I keep reading to see if I can find the answer. So again, when you're reading, this is where you should be underlining, annotating, highlighting, asking questions, and looking for identifiers, right, that are sort of cluing you into what this text is about. And then rereading. So after you read, I highly suggest to reread. And again, it shouldn't take you as long, especially if you're a slow reader, to reread and go back through it. As long as you've done some of those steps and those techniques in the reading stage, this should just be to refresh you and address any lingering questions you have, right? So if the author mentions something and by the end you don't think that that author really got to what that was, you can reread and see if maybe you missed it. This is also, again, where you can ask more questions, right? So again, ask yourself, what are some of the key questions that this essay is trying to address, right? What are their research questions? What is the purpose? Why did they write this? What should I know after reading this text? What answers or evidence does the author provide? Does the author argue that their questions, their research questions or argument is important, right? Do they tell me why I should care about this? And do you understand that overall argument? This might be good, again, to sort of write down and keep in a notebook and use every time you read, because these are sort of the essential points you should be getting from the reading. And if you can't answer them after reading something, that means that you missed something. You need to go back and try to find it in the reading, whether that person utilizes identifiers that you can use to help you find it, or whether you're utilizing the first and last rule to see if, okay, I didn't understand what the overall thesis was. Is it maybe located here? And so if you're somebody in the rereading stage and you need to do some more in-depth question asking, I highly suggest, keeping a reading journal, right? Writing down what you learn, key points, evidence, etc., etc. And when you're doing that, put them in your own words. So instead of just, copying word for word in your reading journal, what you read, read what they wrote, synthesize it, take that information and then put it in your own words. That's a good indicator of if you know what the text is talking about, you should be able to put it in your own words. Some other additional reading strategies. So again, if you're not a good reader, or maybe you're good at reading but you want maybe a different approach at reading, maybe there's something that's not as I would say, as useful to you in your reading strategies, or if you think that your reading strategies could be better improved, here are some additional things you can do. So, again, as we're humans, humans are prone to be able to understand oral speech well. That is why, humans are communicative species, right? We communicate with each other. So, if you're not good at reading things, try to analyze oral speech. So again, a sort of practice you can do out in the real world is if you're somebody who likes to sit maybe at a park bench, or sit outside and eat your lunch, or sit in a restaurant and eat your lunch, listen to the people around you, right? Listen to what they're saying and see if you can analyze what their arguments are. Again, all language is persuasive, right? So if somebody's trying to persuade their friend to go to the movies, listen to their speech, see what evidence they give for why their friend should go to the movies, what their argument is, and if you can analyze oral speech, then you likely can utilize those strategies in your own reading. And again, maybe you don't want to be somebody who sits around and listens to people out in public, right? There are definitely great speeches by presidents, civil rights leaders, great influencers that you can listen to and try to break down their speech. It might be more natural for you to hear it and break it down and then apply those strategies to reading. Make useful outside connections to the reading. So again, if you're somebody who likes to use associations as you're reading, try to say, oh, that reminds me of this and that reminds me of that. That can help you to sort of remember the reading as well as understand its overall purpose. Try text-to-speech when available. So again, sometimes a lot of PDFs will have the voice options. So again, for this particular reading, if you hit, read aloud, and you hit this play button, it'll start reading this out loud to you. I don't want to do that now, but if if you're somebody who needs to hear it read aloud, you can go, usually these three little dots over here, click on read aloud.
Level.
And then you can, hit play and sort of read through it. These buttons help you sort of skip to the next sentences. And then there are the voice options, so if you need it slowed down, sped up, that can be very helpful if you're somebody who, likes to read along as somebody else reads with you. And then see if anybody has responded to the reading that you read, particularly with academic articles such as this one. One's written by researchers. Oftentimes somebody has reviewed it. That's called a literature review. You can see if somebody has responded to or has written about it, and see after reading what somebody else has said about it, you can sort of gauge whether you understood it. There's been a few times I've read something and I had to read somebody else's response to it in order to fully understand what the argument was. So again, if you're unsure, see if there's any blogs, YouTube videos, or literature reviews of somebody reviewing that work, and that can help you to understand the reading, and also provide just a unique perspective, right? Maybe that person, reads it and you have one perspective, they have another one, and hearing their perspective sort of maybe makes a light bulb go off and you're like, oh, I never considered that. That's a really good analysis of this piece. And again, that's about it. You should have at this point a free writing assignment to do on your discussion post. But if there's anything that doesn't make sense, or if you need a refresher, again, reread the text that I gave you, utilize these strategies in your own reading, and hopefully you learned something today, right? Maybe there's some sort of strategy in the previewing stage, or in the reading stage, or in the rereading stage that you've never used or you think could be improved on. So hopefully you've gotten some ideas on how to improve your reading. And as always, if you have any questions, just please, email me or, raise your hand in class so we can talk about them, okay? Well, have a great rest of your day, and hopefully your reading strategies can be improved or at least built upon at this point.